I'm Tabetha Garman, Associate Professor of History and Humanities at Northeast State Community College. And Lisa Williams of the Johnson City Public Library invited me to come talk to you about the role Tennessee played in women's suffrage last spring. And then everything got kind of haywire. And it's taken me a little while to figure out how to get this information to you, but I think we've hit on a pretty happy solution. And I couldn't be happier with the timing, what with the election coming up. It might surprise you to learn that Tennessee played a huge role in a lot of national decisions that went into the formation of this country. Not that I'm saying Tennessee doesn't play a huge role now, but I think Tennesseans have kind of lost their way, and we'll talk about more of that later. Right now, what we're going to look at is this gigantic role Tennessee played in getting women in the United States the right to vote. But before I can tell you that story, I need to give you a little bit of background information so you understand how we got to be in the spotlight. Now, back in the colonial days, in some of the colonies, depending on what colony you were in, some women were allowed to vote and participate in colonial governance. And even after the American Revolution, in some states, women were allowed to vote. Not very many, mind you, but some women were allowed. When the Constitution was ratified, that kind of went away as it was decided that only men who owned property could vote, and then eventually those laws were evolved to change to incorporate all men, and women were kind of left out in the cold. When we started pushing west, as we expanded our borders, in some territories where the amount of people who voted could determine whether or not a territory was allowed to become a state, you're right, women could vote. And that would be taken away once statehood was achieved. In Colorado, women fought hard to get the right to vote, but that was left at the whim of state governments who change every few years. And one group would be elected in who would vote to allow women to vote, and then a new group would be voted in and they would take it away, and it was going back and forth. Now, for a lot of people, history textbooks highlight Susan B. Anthony as the beginning and end of women's suffrage, and that's called tokenism, by the way. It's when you grab a person of another race or another gender and say, here's this person, now we've fulfilled our duty to be inclusive and moving on. Unfortunately, that cuts out the thousands and tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of women who struggled for decades to try to get women the right to vote. All of this starts coming to a head in the early 1900s as there's a big shift in the women's movements of the day. Previously, the idea would have been it would be easier to take on state governments, and it was. But like I said, that was fleeting and the victories could be transient. By the 1900s, a new idea had taken hold. What women really needed was an amendment to the federal Constitution. We need to permanently put in the Constitution that women have the right to vote. Now, in order to do that, you have to get the nation involved, not just local governments. And that's where Alice Paul came in. She organized radical protests with women standing outside the White House holding signs known as the Silent Sentinels, and parades and marches through Washington, D.C. Huge movements. That, by the way, is the point of a protest. It's to get people talking. See, what Alice Paul wanted was people to talk about whether or not women should have the right to vote. And for those people that didn't want to allow women the right to vote, it was a way of forcing them to explain themselves. Why not? Why shouldn't women be allowed the vote? That's a good hallmark, by the way, for all the protests that are going on right now. The point of a protest is to get people talking about the issues. People who are against those issues will do their best to muddy up the rationale behind the protest, to make it confusing or ununderstandable, to make it seem like it's nothing or just chaos. If they do that, then they destroy the point of the protest, which is to get people to talk about the issue. So keep in mind that when you're looking at the protests that are going on, try to figure out what the protesters are saying, not how people interpret it, because that interpretation could be politically muddled on purpose to take away your ability to make a clear decision on what you stand for. But anyway, Alice understood that, and so she was making women's suffrage an issue that people had to pick a side on, and it worked. This political pressure kept building and building and building, and congressmen were asked when they were running for office, where they stood on the idea of women's suffrage, and it became an issue that people cared about. And that's how Congress ended up writing the 19th Amendment. They constructed it to allow women the right to vote. It's signed by Woodrow Wilson, but the fight doesn't end there. That's just the beginning. The 10th Amendment in the Bill of Rights says that anything that's in the Constitution falls to the states. That's another thing that state politicians love to confuse. If I can get you to fixate all your happiness or rage on the president of the United States as opposed to the state government, then the state government can stay in power, which Tennessee is a great example of. But again, we'll get back to that later. So now we have the 19th Amendment, and it moves from the White House to the states. And each state needs to vote to make a decision whether or not they will allow this to become the amendment to the Constitution, or if they're going to shoot it down. And that pretty much brings us up to date. We needed 36 states, and it comes down to Tennessee.
Everyone knows it gets hot in Nashville round about July, and the summer of 1920 was no different. Just shy of 120,000 folks lived in the capital city, making it the second largest in the state. Memphis was slightly larger, unsurprisingly. The potent mixture of blues and speakeasy booze drew in all types, from aspiring artists and music legends in the making to those climbing their way up the ladder of organized crime. Not that Nashville didn't have its share of vice. What capital city doesn't? Smoke-filled, whiskey-soaked meetings with a heavy dose of political corruption and cronyism was its preferred dereliction, as befitted the national political attitudes of the Roaring Twenties. Taking pride of place in the political landscape was the Beaux Arts beauty, the Hermitage Hotel. At 10 stories tall, it was considered a skyscraper back then, and thus made a powerful landmark in the city's profile. Its $1 million price tag included the services of renowned architect James Edwin Ruthven Carpenter, who constructed it to be fireproof, noiseproof, and dustproof, at least according to its advertisements. While it had a basement grill and luxurious ballrooms, its biggest claim to fame was a stunning lobby with carvings and gold leaf and chintz, whose grand staircases and marbled columns let visitors know they had truly arrived. The Hermitage, in other words, was the place to be for the great and good, and the not-so-great and the not-so-good of Nashville back in the day. Once it became clear that Tennessee would be the critical vote in the quest for gender political equality, pro- and anti-suffragists rushed into Nashville like the Cumberland River floodwaters had a decade earlier. Only this time the streets were awash with derby hats and tweed suits instead of Tennessee Valley mud. The Hermitage rapidly filled as mostly male anti-suffrage agitators grabbed up scores of rooms, forcing female suffragettes to seek lodgings elsewhere. It was in her lobbies that polite political conversations begun in the afternoon turned into bawdy public brawls by evening. Opinionists penned dozens of letters to the editor, declaring suffragettes unchristian man-haters who were seeking to destroy the traditional Southern family in one edition, and revolutionary leaders aspiring to fulfill the promise of America in the next. This divergence in ideas spilled into fashion, too. In a 1920s version of the modern trucker cap, those opposed to political equality pinned red roses in their lapels, and those for used yellow. Newspapers across the state ran headlines declaring it the War of the Roses, and so it was. This was the era of yellow journalism, when every crime was the crime of the century, and the news was a source of entertainment made widely available for the first time in our history. The fight for women's suffrage was a story followed across the country, and the general consensus for both sides was that the soul of our very nation, the American way of life as a whole, was at stake. Red Roses were arguing that if given the right to vote, women would vote for socialism or, heaven forbid, communism, an implication that was particularly powerful given that this was all taking place during the Russian Revolution and our first Red Scare. The issue of women's suffrage was, to use the modern vernacular, epic. And at the very center, the place with the final answer to this battle royale was Nashville, Tennessee. And though the vote would be cast in the Capitol building, the decision would be made in the halls of the Hermitage Hotel. Political strategist and intellectual Nashvilleian Catherine Kenny took up residence in the Hermitage lobby. She well understood the political machine and had been pivotal in the fight to get the 19th Amendment written by Congress. At her side was Abby Milton, Chattanoogan lawyer and president of the Tennessee Equal Suffrage Association. Together, they had organized local suffrage societies all across the state, building clubs in almost every county, ready to combat the relentless attacks of those who opposed equality. Their goal that hot summer was to lobby every single member of the Tennessee General Assembly, and using congressional districts as a roadmap, they charged into battle. This would be no easy feat. The red roses far outnumbered the yellow at the Hermitage Hotel, but not all came to that choice out of political honesty or passionate belief. Anti-suffrage organizations combined to rent a suite, which was quickly dubbed the Jack Daniels Suite, to hand out whiskey to all those men wearing crimson boutonnieres. Free whiskey would lure in most folks, even today, but back then it was 20 times as tantalizing. Nashville had enacted a city-wide alcohol ban in 1909, and national prohibition had just gone into effect that January. Abby Milton later recalled in interviews recorded in the mid-1980s that the lobby would be unfit and even dangerous for a woman to traverse by mid-afternoon, so many drunken men glutted the space. When she and other suffragettes complained to the state government, they were told it was the Tennessee way. Not that the suffragettes were free of vice, mind. At the time, there was a social taboo against women smoking, but that didn't stop Lulu Reese, the 60-year-old firebrand from Memphis, from setting up a secret smoking lounge in her rented Hermitage rooms for suffragettes who needed a drag. I'd like to think that more than one secret bodice flask was handed around, too, as women used Tennessee's finest to gird themselves for the fight ahead. But if so, they left no historic record. And women didn't totally eschew the Jack Daniels room either, although they were not allowed to enter. Sue White, better known as Miss Sue, took to loitering outside the suite in an effort to overhear something of strategic value and to discover which legislators were bribable. She preferred aggressive tactics like that. Before Congress penned the 19th Amendment, she had traveled to the White House front gate, where she defiantly held a banner chastising President Wilson's failure to support women's rights, and was even arrested in that cause, earning her a place among Alice Paul's fearless, silent sentinels. Her participation with the radical Paul was brought up frequently in newspaper articles, particularly after reporters discovered her scheme and labeled her the suffragette spy from Henderson, Tennessee. While women like White took a blunt approach, others used the press in an attempt to shame the Jack Daniels suite out of existence. Turnabout is, after all, fair play, and morality was a major theme of the anti-suffrage movement. Ministers across the state were vocal about the unchristian implications should women be allowed the vote. When Carrie Chapman Catt, the hand-picked successor to Susan B. Anthony and president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, arrived at the Hermitage, copies of her Women's Bible was put on display as proof of the anti-religious nature of suffrage. The press reported it contained all sorts of heresies, thus ministers avoided it and cautioned their flocks not to read it, lest they become tainted. In truth, the book simply challenged the religious orthodoxy that put women as subservient to men, but if no one reads the book, one can make it say whatever one likes, and women who tried to defend the publication were declared ungodly by those who had only heard salacious rumors of what was in it. Abby Milton estimated that at least 26 Nashville ministers became anti-suffragist apologists after viewing the Catt's Bible display set up in a Hermitage meeting room, building on the religious spin that had raged against suffrage in the region since the end of the Civil War. The cherry-picked theological debate was home turf to Knoxville's Lizzie French, who had engaged in intellectual battles in the market square since the 1880s. Her magazine, The People, exposed religious and political corruption, as she passionately argued that giving women the right to vote would improve government morality, not degrade it. As president of the Tennessee Suffrage Association, she had publicly debated anti-suffrage leaders on the stages of the 1913 National Conservation Exposition. To combat the endless wave of religious columnists condemning suffrage as anti-Christian, French set up committees to pen immediate responses and saw to it that they were published. Lizzie's own letters are reminiscent of the testimony of Anne Hutchinson, who was also accused of heresy centuries before, when she dared to argue for women's religious equality in the Calvinist colonies of old. Like Anne, Lizzie answered scripture with scripture, challenging anti-suffrage interpretations of the Bible using the Bible to bolster her argument. For those less inclined to follow intellectual debates via letters to the editor, there was the Anne Dudley approach. Born and raised in Nashville, Dudley focused some of her efforts parrying the public portrayal of suffragettes as negligent wives and mothers. Political cartoons and posters portrayed them as ugly, idiotic, man-hating spinsters and implied their demand for political equality was born out of a jealous desire to destroy the idyllic Southern families they themselves were denied. Interesting that even then a woman's appearance was used as visual shorthand to imply intelligence and moral fiber, but I digress. A picture, even when hand-drawn, is worth 1,000 words, a fact not lost on our Anne Dudley. Using herself and her 2 children as models, she posed for a series of soft-focused photos reproduced in publications nationwide. Each portrait emphasized her devotion to both her family and the cause of suffrage. In one, they snuggle in a chair. In another, she's reading them a book. All were designed to smash the stereotypes propagated by the red roses. Drawings based on those pictures, coupled with pro-suffrage political slogans, were plastered across the city and littered the streets of Nashville as the long, hot summer days bore on. I mentioned earlier that these arguments had been going on since the end of Civil War, and so they had. The role of women in the Southern hierarchy had been used so often in regional history that it was cliché. Preventing women from sharing the burden of governance was used to justify slavery, sexist interpretations of chivalry, and even the formation and defense of the Confederacy itself. Those old slogans were dusted off once again at the Hermitage, with red roses arguing that the acceptance of gender equality would lead to a demand for racial equality and thus a degradation of white heritage. Many anti-suffrage supporters, including some women, openly courted white supremacist movements, linking the sexist and racist causes together in a twisted version of Southern history. It isn't coincidental, as an aside, that several of the 105 Confederate statues in Tennessee were erected during the suffrage and civil rights movements to reinforce this manipulative view of our history. Civil rights leaders in Nashville cautiously watched events unfold in 1920. Despite the racists' claims, allowing white women to vote did not mean that black women would be extended the same courtesy, or that voting as an African American of any gender in Tennessee would get easier. On the other hand, it did offer an obvious political connection, that of equality, and a stage on which to advocate for it. The 19-teens had birthed a national artistic and academic movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, and music that originated on the back streets of Memphis became its soundtrack. Protests led by civil rights luminaries like W.E.B. Du Bois took place alongside the demonstrations of Alice Paul and the Silent Sentinels. The movements were intertwined in the national zeitgeist, for better and for worse. Frankie Pierce was very aware of the tightrope being walked that summer in her hometown. In a way, she had been born into local politics. Her mother, Nellie, had been enslaved by a Smith County legislator. Frankie intimately understood the power of education, a cause she had championed across her city. She had attended Roger Williams University, worked as a teacher, and started a vocational school for African American girls. In her spare time, she served as president of the Negro Women's Reconstruction League, was the founder of the Nashville Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, and was on the first committee managing the Blue Triangle League of the YWCA. If something needed moving, Frankie moved it. If something required shaking, she shook. In May of 1920, at the state suffrage convention held on the very floor of the Tennessee House Chamber, Frankie Pierce took to the stage at the invitation of Catherine Kinney. There she vowed that if given the vote, African American women would stand alongside white women, saying that they shared a common cause in demanding, quote, a square deal, and, quote, recognition in all forms of this government. And later, much later, when it became clear that voting rights were still not equal in Tennessee, no matter what the state and federal constitutions said, she took up the banner again, fighting the good fight until her death in 1954. And so the war over who should have the right to vote roared on. Decades of debate compressed into one long, hot summer in Nashville, Tennessee. Every political tactic was used to put off the vote. Multiple attempts were made to shove it down the line or table it all together, and one by one the suffragettes and the Yellow Roses withstood the blows and lived on to fight another day. Desperately, a handful of anti-ratification legislators, who dubbed themselves leaders of the Red Rose Brigade, attempted a dramatic dodge. A midnight flight, or rather a 3 a.m. train ride, was made to Alabama in an effort to deny a quorum and thus delay the vote yet again. They failed in their errand, and the proceedings went on without them. If one were to count the red roses on display in the chamber that August, it appeared the 19th Amendment was about to go down in flames. Almost every legislator wore one. Even the youngest legislator in Tennessee history, 24-year-old Harry Byrne from McMinn County, boldly jammed a red bud into his buttonhole as he headed into the House to cast his vote. There was yet another call to postpone, which caused suffragettes swarming outside the buildings to doubt the vote would even take place at all. Then came the last-minute switch from for to against the delay by Banks Turner, representative of Gibson County, and the deadlock was broken, and the vote for women's suffrage came to the floor at last. That narrow defeat left the outcome of the actual vote anyone's guess, although most of the backroom gamblers in the city would have put money on women being regulated to the kitchen the next election day. It was the commonly held belief that while it would be close, suffrage would die on the carpeted floor of the Tennessee House chamber, and that is what made what actually happened such a shock. Phoebe Byrne, who went by the far more utilitarian name of Feb, was a solid country stock. She was the widow of the Mouse Creek station master and ran a farm in the mountains of East Tennessee. If one were to choose words to describe Feb, passive or retiring would not be among them. She was fierce and determined and educated. She held a college degree from U.S. Grant University, which was highly unusual for women at the time and downright unheard of in Nyota, Tennessee. And she boasted of reading 3 newspapers every day. She had followed the call for women's suffrage for decades and was particularly enthralled with those she referred to as militants, who dramatically marched and chained themselves to government grates across the country. That, Feb thought, was how to get things done. She raised her 2 boys to be civically engaged and spoke to them often about issues at hand. It was no surprise to her when her boy Harry won his bid to become a state representative at the ripe age of 22. What did surprise her, however, were the reports she read declaring that her son's attitude towards suffrage was wavering. At first, Harry Byrne openly declared himself a supporter of the amendment. But then unscrupulous party politicians inundated him with fraudulent telegrams claiming to be from his constituents, demanding he uphold his oath to represent McMinn County and vote against it. He was, after all, elected to represent the people of his district, not his own interests, and ever conscious of his civic duty, Harry picked up a red rose to declare his intent, a change of attire noted in the newspapers Feb devoured every morning. Action was required, thought Feb, and she decided a letter may just do the trick. And so, as the yeas and nays added up in the sweltering House chamber, it came at last down to Harry. His was the last vote needed to bestow or deny American women a voice in their government. All the other states had either cast their votes or declared their intention to avoid the vote entirely. Only one more state was needed to gain the perfect 36 required to make the 19th Amendment a permanent addition to the U.S. Constitution, and only one more state remained. It literally came down to this moment, to that summer, to Tennessee, and it fell squarely on the shoulders of Feb Burns's boy. As Harry looked up over his red rose and clearly called out an aye in favor of the amendment, it reverberated across the silent room and down the hallowed halls of history before exploding into cheers on the streets of Nashville. A last-minute political switch that sent shockwaves across the nation. Later, after posing with triumphant suffragettes shaking his hand on the Capitol steps, when asked by reporters why he changed his mind, Harry drew from his pocket an envelope and removed a smart piece of stationery upon which Feb had written, "Dear son, hurrah and vote for suffrage. Don't forget to be a good boy and help Mrs. Cat put the rat in ratification." After showing the letter, Harry said that he knew, quote, that a mother's advice is always safest for a boy to follow, and my mother wanted me to vote for ratification. The women of Tennessee were the last soldiers to take to the field in a political war that had begun decades, even centuries earlier. On August 26, 1920, the official documents from the Tennessee state government reached Washington, D.C., where they were verified and signed by the Secretary of State, and only then did our feminist heroes remove their yellow roses and lay down their political banners. The respite, as those lovers of history know, was short-lived. These veterans would be called on again as the quest for true equality continued. But for a moment there, in the summer of 1920, victory was declared in Nashville, Tennessee.
And that's how Tennessee got women the right to vote in the United States. Like I said at the beginning of all of this, I kind of believe that Tennesseans have lost their way. We have the third lowest voter turnout in the United States, and East Tennessee counties have the lowest turnout in the state with the lowest voter turnout. In all, only about half of the people that are registered to vote in Tennessee vote, and the people that are registered to vote represent a very small percentage of the Tennesseans who are eligible to register, but haven't even bothered to do that. We can't have a say in the government if we're not participants in it. I know people like to muddy up the waters and say we're not a democracy, we're a representative republic and all of that, but the bottom line is it always comes down to us. The first three words of the Constitution are "we the people." And if we don't actively participate in what's going on in our state and in our country, well, we lose out a lot. The other problem Tennesseans have is voting uninformed. They make decisions based on a political party allegiance that they imagine their family has, or a slogan or a bumper sticker or something like that. That's no good. Like the story we just talked about, Tennesseans used to be pretty thoughtful about what they said and challenged ideas. Debates raged in Tennessee newspapers as people went back and forth exchanging ideas. There wasn't this shutout or the idea that all real Tennesseans vote this way or think this way. That's also led to a local and state government that is, well, full of people that have been there for decades because we refuse to vote them out. That's problematic too. So I hope this little presentation kind of inspires you to take an active interest in what's happening in national and local politics. After all, it's the congressmen and the senators that write the laws, not the President of the United States. And understanding the role we play in determining the outcome of our government is, well, it's the Tennessee way. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. And if you have any questions, I'm going to leave my email somewhere around here so you can email me. I'll be happy to discuss it with you. I think that's all I have to say for today. Remember to register to vote. I'll see you later.